Kia ora tātou, welcome back everybody. And our councillors online as well. Right, we're now to number 11 on our order paper, and councillors, we've still got quite a big agenda ahead of us, so I'll look at how we're going in terms of comments and questioning. Well, questions, certainly comments, we might have to limit those if it's looking pretty straightforward. Okay, number 11 is transport choices around cycling, and a report to us from Hamish Feitenby, our Group Manager of Transport. Hamish, page 253, councillors.
Good afternoon, Mr Mayor and councillors. I'd like to present this paper as read, just with a few minor comments. This program gives effect to some of our obligations under the Pinati Agreement with Waka Kotahi towards the active modes portion of that program, and we've picked the sites in particular because we've already begun some of the work on their feedback and some of the engagement work already done on those sites. Happy to take any questions, and yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Hamish. So effectively this is a contribution, external contribution to us of $4,893,000.
Correct, yes.
What do we need to put to it?
It will just be officer time. So we'll be working towards these, so we'll be doing engagement and design work, but it's 100% subsidised effectively, so some of the costs will go to that project next year. Just also to mention that most of the work is actually for next year, so that's why there's a few recommendations there to work through.
And Hamish, we've been told before that if we add things in, something falls out. Is that in this case, or is this something that perhaps can be done in a concurrent, i.e. using perhaps some different contractors, so we can keep, you know, the other parts of our programs still going?
So in terms of contractor capacity, we'll be putting it out to the market to find out who's got the best option for us. In terms of the workflow, yeah, we will be looking at we've already looked at next year's programs and made some changes in that space. The map that we put together is a map of all the work that we're going to do for the year, so if we were able to compare that to what we had planned, it would look quite different. So we've consolidated down to these 3 projects for the year, 2 of which are transport.
So you already made room for these?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Other questions from Councillor Isabella?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Kia ora, thank you for your report. I wanted to ask a question about the Summerhill proportion of the proposed works, and noting there's already been quite a lot of work done for Plan Change G, specifically around safety on Summerhill Drive and the State Highway. I'm wondering, we may not be at this level of planning yet, but are we able to pick up on some of those safety concerns for cyclists and pedestrians as part of this work, in terms specifically around Ruapehu Drive and the right turn? I can explain more if you like.
Thank you for the question. Yes, we are including that in our design brief to the consultants. They have begun some of that work already due to the work that's already ongoing there. Yes, so yes, absolutely.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Thanks, Hamish. So just around capacity to do this work, in 5.6 it says there'll be other active transport projects deferred next year, etc. This will be discussed at the council meeting. So are there other projects that we need to be aware of that will have to be deferred at this time, or is that still something to be considered?
So through you, Mr Mayor, we did have some projects in for next year for cycling that we will be deferring for the decision to the LTP. So, for example, Botanical Road was on our list initially. We decided to consolidate it to the ones that we're already working on. So we've already done engagement on Featherston Street for the Streets for People program, and we've already done some work towards the Summerhill. So, and to get through those projects, yeah, we consolidated it back a bit.
Okay, so you've identified Botanical Road. Are there other areas that will have to be deferred that you know of now?
Not off the top of my head.
But you,
Yes, there was some.
but in 5.6, you're signalling that there will need to be other areas deferred in order to prioritise this work that we're getting the money for.
On the cycling program, correct.
Okay. So at what stage do you think we might be in a position to know what they are?
As part of the annual budget discussions, we'll be talking about whether we try and either defer them to the LTP for another discussion or decide to go ahead with them at that point.
Okay. It's just that if I have we're all happy that we're getting extra money, don't get me wrong. But I'm aware that we've got the Urban Cycleway Master Plan, and so I'm just a bit cautious about us deferring parts of it and doing other parts. Is it still in our plan to deliver on that, but just in a different time frame?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
yes.
okay, cool, thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and just a couple of questions. Thank you for the report. Paragraph 4.1 on page 257 talks about the challenges around public acceptance of cycle lanes, and also goes on to say this will be discussed at the council meeting. So I suppose my first question is, what were you hoping to bring to the discussion of this point?
I would actually like to defer to Donna Baker if she's available. So Donna's team are looking after the engagement piece of that work.
Thank you.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, was interested to know what the authors of the report had hoped to discuss around the public engagement and public acceptance of cycleways. Makes reference to implementing learnings from previous projects, and I'd just like to know what the thinking is there.
Okay. Through the chair, the Streets for People, which is a program that's already in place, involves significant engagement, and the team has already been to 120 businesses in the first round of public feedback for the Featherston Street. So there is significant engagement in that. In the transport choices, there is not expected to be that level of engagement. So the risk around this is that we will be seen to be doing work a lot quicker without taking the community along with us. So we will have engaged significantly around the program of work that's already in place, but the new parts that are suggested, there won't be that level of engagement. We won't be able to go to all of the businesses one-on-one and do all of the letterbox drops. So one of the risks around that is that we will be pushing through work without taking the community with us. And there is also a risk around people seeing us and not feeling that, or understanding that Waka Kotahi is paying for this, and they see us doing cycleways without understanding that that money has come somewhere else, from somewhere else, and that we are doing nice to haves rather than doing remedial work such as potholes, etc. So there are some risks around getting some information out to the community.
Thank you for speaking to those risks. Is it officers' intent to accept those as they sit, or to work to ameliorate them?
We will need to work to ameliorate them. However, the timeframes that we have got are restricted on this new program. So whilst we can add on to what we've been doing in the Featherston Street, if we start going into new areas, then it's going to be more difficult. So we will obviously work as much as we can to get the information out to the community, but we do have to be aware that there are time constraints around it.
Thank you. Further to that, can I understand, will we be making an effort to engage with the broader community, or is it principally around hearing the relatively few voices of disaffected property owners on specific streets?
For the new parts that are being included, it will be more around hearing the disaffected rather than being able to go out wider to the community.
So can I understand, in an age of highly connected and online communication, kind of what the barriers are to us connecting broadly in the community around this initiative, given the substantial community-wide interest that there is in the safety deficits of this street?
We will continue to do online communications, but what we've been doing with Featherston Street so far has been going one-on-one to the businesses, and that's very time-consuming for the officers. So we won't be able to continue to do that in the fullness of this program.
Okay, so I'm understanding then that we will have opportunities for engagement, but they won't be as rich as a door-to-door type of experience.
That's correct.
Thank you. I had some questions in the Summerhill space as well. Was just interested if the intent with this investment is to address some of the issues that are perhaps unintended consequences of the recent efforts to improve Summerhill, especially around the coffee cart and some of the conflicts that have been introduced in that space or exacerbated in that space in recent times.
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, we're looking at reviewing that whole section, including the work that's already been done in that space, to see whether it's still fit for the entire route. There are some options to move the cycleway or the pathway off the road entirely. But there will be trade-offs in that space from trees, a couple of trees perhaps. But we're still working through different options. And I guess the timing that we've put to you is to try and provide some of those options to see what would be palatable as a trade-off, because space is limited.
Thank you. And the other one in the design space, because I'm sure we'll get questions about this, kind of ending the Featherston effort, at least this stage of it, at Ruahine Street. It leaves Freiburg and Ross tantalizingly close, but on the wrong side of the street. What would be our answer to constituents that have concerns around active transport commutes into Freiburg and to Ross?
So the thinking initially was that would be, in terms of capacity to get to that point, we'd certainly be doing the engagement and the design for the whole route, and then have that as the next section following that. So hopefully early in the new LTP.
So we might optimistically at least think about 24, 25 being a delivery window that could see the rest of Featherston.
Correct, and we'd be doing the design for that section at the same time as this work, because it's, fit together.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate the answers. Thank you for the answers, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you. My first question is about Ross and Freiburg connectivity, so thank you to Councillor Barrett for picking that up. And the second part, along similar lines, was the Summerhill red line, which stops tantalisingly short of the Johnston Drive issue. Is there any consideration of bringing that Johnston Drive piece of work into this?
In this program, we, similar to the Freiburg issue, we'll be doing the design at the same time under a different program. Rather than the Transport Choices one, there's some significant engineering issues there as well, and along with the Akatri plan change, there's a few more moving parts to that piece. So we're thinking capacity-wise, that's where we'd get to under this program.
And has this been ongoing discussion with Waka Kotahi? Are they on board with us bringing this into this piece of work under a different category? Are they still resistant to what we'd like to see up there?
We're working through the options up there. As discussed, there are some engineering challenges, and for that section of the city to work properly, we need to work very closely with the Waka Kotahi.
Okay, thank you, Hamish.
Councillor Johnson.
Sorry, thank you for letting me pop back in with another question. I'm aware that the link between the off-road cycleway from Longburn to the central city, the link that's missing is the bit between Botanical Road and West Street. Will the plans for completing that be affected by the deferrals? Or when is that planned to be done?
So On the map on page 256, there's a little blue line. So the piece we are leaving in as part of our standard cycle improvement program is that section. There's a paper coming to the Economic Growth Committee next week, I believe, with options for your consideration.
Oh, what excellent news. Thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Can I just clarify the section in Summerhill that's coming up from Tennant's Drive up through to the shopping centre? It was only a couple of years ago that we did a cycle treatment through there and changed some of the offset car parking and created quite a response from the businesses up on the top there that we worked through. What are we doing through that stretch that we haven't done a couple of years ago?
So we're just reviewing the efficacy of the cycle route through that section as well as the entire road to make sure that it's a cohesive sort of section of cycle path. We're not committing to changing anything until we've been through that process. It may not be necessary, it may tie in just fine with whatever the new sections are going to be, but we want it to be consistent, easily recognisable.
Okay. Thank you. I have a comment. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. My question was along the same lines as Councillor Dennison. I'm just looking at our council Facebook page, and we did do the Summerhill Drive transformation about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. Yeah, probably a question for Mark, and do we run the risk of being seen to effectively be redoing the work that we just did, within recent memory?
Could I defer to Donna Baker on that question as well? Wondering, Donna, the question was whether there's a risk if we make changes on Summerhill to existing infrastructure that it may be a negative perception on us.
Through the chair, I know that there is work already being done around the perception based on the fact that there were some feedback that came back that the design wasn't appropriate. And there will be some construction impacts that could be significant. So we would need to continue to engage with the community. There are some risks, there's always risks, but we would ameliorate those as much as possible. And we would have to look at parking because that is one of the concerns that has been raised. So there's ongoing work that needs to be done, and we would continue to work with the transport team to ameliorate those.
Thank you. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, given we've got many roads in the city in dire need of cycle safety measures, and given we've just upgraded Summerhill Drive a year or two ago, how did we get to a point where doing another upgrade of Summerhill Drive got it put at the top of the priority list? Was that a council decision, or how did we get to this point? That's, I guess, what I'm trying to get at.
So we have a cycle network master plan which has some priorities around cycleways. Other parts of the city have other cycling connections or other ways to get to it, and I guess that's how this one has ended up on the top of the list. There's also been some deaths and serious injuries on that section, cyclists that we would like to sort out as much as we possibly can, and there's an awful lot of traffic with the new Gorge Road not completed. So
Those have came since we've upgraded it. There have been a series of accidents.
yes, there's been incidents and accidents we've
Excellent.
been reported.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Hamish. That's the questions done. So we've got this Transport Choices Cycling, 2 resolutions there that Council delegate authority to the Chief Executive to sign the Transport Choices Agreement with NZTA for 4.893 million over 2022-23 and 23-24 years at a funding assistance rate of 100%. That Council note the constrained project timeline and agree a decision-making forum be to enable decisions on final design to be made in August 2023. Right, number 3. that council approve the creation of a new program called Transport Choices Cycleways to reflect both the additional capital new expenditure and additional subsidy revenue, which breaks down as follows. An increase of 300,000 in the 2022-23 capital new budget for design, engineering and engagement and consultation costs. An increase to NZTA's capital revenue of 300,000 being 100% of the new budget for 22-23. That council note commitment to the addition of the Transport Choices Cycleways of 4.593 million into the 2023-24 annual budget for capital new for construction and associated increase to the NZTA Waka Kotahi capital revenue of 4,593,000 in the 23-24 annual budget. I'm happy to move those, seconded by Councillor Dennison. And this page as well, right. And number 5, that council approve an increase of 208,000 to the Streets for People budget for the 23-24 financial year as contingency for the Streets for People Featherston Street project at the funding assistant rate of 90% from Waka Kotahi. That number 6, council noted decrease of 1,688,000 for program 1559 citywide urban cycle infrastructure network improvements will be included in the 23-24 annual budget. And I hope finally number 7, that council noted decrease in the NZTA capital revenue for program 1559 citywide urban cycleway infrastructure network improvements of 780,000 and a decrease in the PNCC debt funding for this program of 908,000 will be included in the 23-24 annual budget. Are we done? Great. All right, moved by myself, seconded by Councillor Dennison. I'll open it up for comments. Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is great news and a great response. The only thing I wanted to stand to speak on is the Summerhill Stretcher Road, and I guess quite surprised that that's in this tranche of review. I guess a review's fine, but to actually do any more physical works, I'd be wondering why, after the consultation last time and the works, and the become a little bit of a hot potato up there around who was dealing with the business owners and what they were hoping to achieve out of it. And in the end, I think it's settled, and I understand for the number of cyclists working well. So to do any more physical works up on that stretch, I'd be wondering why. And if so, I think we need to be very delicate in the way we re-engage in that if we are going to do further works. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yep, very good news. Love money from other people. I was very interested in the officer comments about how we're going to communicate this with our community. Those of us who survived, lived through the Pioneer Cycle Highway will know that just telling people that we didn't pay for it so it's all good doesn't really wash. And so we need a strong comms story around this that, well, yes, we accept. Never look a gift horse in the mouth. Thank you, Waka Kotahi, for bringing the pot of money to us, but that there's a strong need for this in our community, and to have a really strong value proposition that supports even the small amount of money that council is putting into it to get the large amount that Waka Kotahi is putting in, because I certainly don't want another petition. Thank you.
Councillor Isabellan.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I likewise am thrilled that we can fast track some safer cycleways at no extra cost to the ratepayer. Summerhill community have been asking for safe road crossings for a long time, and we have been constrained in how we can respond to that. So I'm looking at this as an opportunity to not just look at the cycleways in Summerhill, but also the road crossings, particularly on the state highway getting from the shopping centre across to IPU, and the residential only part of Summerhill is extremely dangerous, especially in peak traffic. We have right turns from Ruapehu. You've also got turns coming in from Pacific Drive, as well as traffic from both sides. Trying to navigate that as a cyclist or a pedestrian, or in fact a right-turning vehicle, is a really hazardous, is a very hazardous thing to undertake. So I'm very encouraged by the officer's comments that there is scope in this to take the safety, traffic safety aspects of the work we've done as part of Plan Change G and the traffic assessment there, and to incorporate those into this work, we get an extra value proposition, not just for the cycleways, which I take Councillor Dennison's point has already been traversed, but we also get in that safety aspect for the pedestrians and potentially other traffic. That is a high risk and high crash site, and we could, if we can get this through the line through this particular funding package, I think that's a huge win that goes just beyond cycleways. So I'm really, really looking forward to seeing how it pans out. Kia ora, thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and as other councillors have said, really pleased to see some extra money flowing in. I think we all understand the general value proposition around what we're trying to achieve through the Urban Cycle Network Master Plan. And really, I think it's been great that we're kind of in the timing that we are, because we've seen the tremendous success that Christchurch is starting to enjoy. They're basically proving the case that when you create safe, separated space and when you link key destinations, you see a huge uplift. So if you look at the stats out of Christchurch, you'll see quite dramatic growth in the use of active transport modes on the back of some quality investment in space. Absolutely fantastic to see staff growing a rather small pot of money into over $8 million thanks to the Streets for People and Transport Choices. Absolutely fantastic. I think one of the lessons that I've still feeling, let's say, from College Street, and let's say from Summerhill, is that in reality we've been quite underinvested and we've been trying to stretch every one of those dollars, and it's kind of led to some compromise outcomes that get us about halfway there, which is actually kind of where we are in Summerhill. So I might speak to that now because it's been raised several times. If there are members that are of the view that things are working well there, I might gently suggest that you have a few more conversations with people in the cycling community. I'd be happy to provide some correspondence that suggests that things are in fact not very well, and in fact the money that was spent 2 years ago has exacerbated issues in some of those locations rather than remedied them. So I'm pleased to hear and pleased to see that there is a line on the map indicating that we will make sure that we get a good end-to-end solution there that works for the business community as well as for the local residents as well as for the people needing to move through that space. The other thing that I think we're learning out of especially College Street is that when you go and you create a whole lot of space but you don't actually separate it, what you end up doing is drawing in bigger vehicles and they go faster, which isn't actually a good outcome when you start thinking about active transport. So we do need to be using this investment in a way that does actually create separation and create traffic speeds that are conducive to use of cycling as a mode of transport. The finance has been commented on a bit in terms of it not being an extra cost to ratepayers. It's really nice to see it's also not an extra cost to taxpayers. This is coming out of the emissions trading scheme. So this is polluter pay investment getting recycled into good public transport. Absolutely pleased to see Featherston Street. It has been, that master plan was generated 4 or 5 years ago now. And Featherston Street was the top of the list at that point. It's only gotten more dangerous since, so it's really great to see that we're finally moving in that space. A little bit tough to hear that Freiburg and Ross are going to have to wait at least an extra year, but we're making some gains there, which is fantastic. Probably a little bit disappointed that on the one hand we are needing to dial back, and Councillor Johnson asked a bit about this, dial back some of the other parts of the master plan, but seeing how much effort and how much engagement it required with the community to get the improvements through in College Street, the improvements partially through in Summerhill. I think doing one thing well is kind of actually quite a good enough target, and hopefully we can build some momentum on that to where we can start looking at concurrent delivery in future years. But I think the doing one thing well is quite good. Community engagement, there will be some pain yet in this space and some challenges, and I would urge staff to be really proactive in terms of how we engage with the broader community as well as those affected residents who may need to make better use of side street parking, may need to make better use of off-street parking than they currently are, so that we can see movement prioritized in some of our key transport corridors. So that's kind of where I was up to in terms of comments. It is a really good news story for this city and for the future of cycling and active transport in the city, and really looking forward to this rolling out. So thanks again to the officers for a huge amount of work to get a reasonable good sum of money rolled up to our doorstep so we can pedal on with.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Yeah, just some general comments. The first one is, I think this demonstrates how important it is to have a plan of work going forward, to have determined what our strategic direction is, to have pinned it down somewhat so that when the opportunity for government funding does come along, we've already got a plan in the drawer that we can take out and accelerate. It's proved useful for us in getting government funding, for example, for Papayoa Place with the Shovel Ready project. It's proved useful here. So if there's any learning to be taken from that, I think it's that we need to be considering you know, in terms of our aspirations, what we ideally want to be doing, even if we don't have money in the budget to do it right now, but we've got the plans, because when the opportunity comes up for some government funding, we can then put our hands up and it's, you know, we're ready to go. So that is a huge plus, I think, and commend all those who've been involved in doing that. Second thing is about Featherston Street. It is an extremely risky street for cyclists. We've had a number of injuries and even fatalities on Featherston Street in recent years. And so I'm very glad to see that prioritised. I am a little concerned, as you may have determined from the questioning, about the deferral of some of the other projects, because really an urban cycleway network only makes sense when it is an actual network, when the destinations are joined up. And so we sort of lend ourselves a little bit open to criticism when we just do a piece at a time to people who say, oh, well, that hasn't increased the number of cyclists. And that's because, you know, cyclists go from A to B. They don't just like materialise magically at the end of the bit that you've just upgraded and get to that end bit there. So I am conscious of the fact that until we have a network, we're not going to really see, we're not going to really see the benefit of increased cycling until people can actually go from destination to destination. So I understand there's capacity constraints and so on, but I do think, you know, I don't want to see that network being delayed as a result of just this focus on this particular section. And then just finally, I think it's very important when we're communicating a cycling project like this that we're not just focusing on affected residents and businesses in the street that's being upgraded. There's a whole community out there, some of whom already cycle and others of whom would like to cycle but don't feel confident to do so just yet. And I think it's very important that we hear those voices, that those people are communicated with, and that we have a communication strategy that doesn't just focus on a segment of road, but focuses on the wider currently cycling community and potential cycling community, because otherwise we tend to get really focused on the negativities of the change to those living in the area and less about the positive change that we're bringing to a wider community. So I just encourage the comms to go out widely and to consider the positives as well as the inconveniences to residents. So, thank you.
Just in write a reply, thanks for your comments. Look, it is good news, but I too have some concerns about how we're going to communicate some of the stuff. There was only a couple of councillors turned up when we were going to close the coffee shop up the top there, and hardly any of the speakers turned up. It was Councillor Dennison and myself, and we do have to be mindful of people that have invested businesses and live on the street. And you'll remember that we had a petition to us. So I think there's an element of bringing the community with us as well. And so I do differ somewhat to some of the comments. But it is great news. To the connections across what is effectively a state highway, that's I've seen quite a few near misses, and I just would implore to the officers, to your colleagues at NZTA, that smaller communities and metros have had pedestrian overbridges, and that road is only, and we're conflicted here because one of our catalytic projects is the regional freight ring road, and that sits right in the middle of all that too. So we do need to do something there because we have a community that's dissected by effectively a state highway, and expecting people to cross it, I think's a bit foolish. It needs to be effectively some sort of overbridge to get people safely, and there's retirement villages up there too. But look, great news. Lots to do, I think, with the officers and obviously the comms, and I'm sure there will be some pain to come. I'll be waiting for the calls. All right, we will vote. There's passed 15 votes for, none against. Thank you. Okay, moving through to our next item, which is around the same topic, but this time public transport. Welcome back, Hamish, and that's on page 263 of your papers.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I will take the report as read and just mention that this was an application put in jointly between Horizons and Palmerston City Council. Unfortunately, my colleague had to leave after this morning's session, but he's in full support, and I'll try and answer any questions as best as I can. Thank you.
Great. I suppose my same question as the start of the other one. Capacity to be able to do this work. Look, it looks great, and again, it's money. It's a good news story, really, for the external money coming to us. We can handle the externals, and we're going to repurpose some of the older bus stops.
Yes, so we have already begun the work on the bus stop. We've figured out where they need to be and how many they need to be. We've updated that recently. We've got more up-to-date numbers, so we're now doing 90 new ones. We're removing 250 and we're keeping 259 existing ones in place, so they all fit within the network. Most of the work is going to externals. We're just managing the consultants that are designing and doing all the engineering for it, and then we'll procure a contractor to uplift them. In terms of reuse, we've started talking with some of our other internal parties. For example, the Parks and Reserves team have put their hand up for a number of them for some of their locations. A netball site apparently would like some way of sheltering their people. So yes, and with so many to remove, we'll be figuring out a way to see what other organisations, so schools or community groups would be interested.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thanks, Hamish. Will we be doing work to address the space constraints for buses trying to access bus stops? It's quite often some of the busier city centre ones are quite squeezed and difficult for buses to get good alignment, especially for users with limited mobility to enter and exit the bus.
Absolutely. So that's the third piece of the work is look at the engineering of each individual site. So of those 90 new locations or builds that we're going to do, we'll be figuring out how we can make it accessible for people with disability issues, and make sure that we can get the vehicles off the road enough that it's a safe environment for all. So.
Thank you. I guess it kind of seemed to me from reading the report, and let me know if I've misread it, but it looked like there were some options for some, I guess, reasonably expensive shelters, at least relative to what we've currently got in the city. And there is also an early signal about potential longer-term programs that might be needed to fully build out the network. And I guess I wanted to get a sense of your thinking in terms of potentially building a slightly lower spec of shelter, but getting the whole thing up and ready soon versus needing to go into out years, and the potential value proposition of more elaborate shelters.
Correct. And that palette of sort of high, medium, low style shelters, we'll be testing that against what we actually need in the network, and then how that would apply to a renewal cycle and the ongoing maintenance that would be required before we commit to any construction options.
And when you talk about what we need in the network, how is that need assessed?
So we've done a GIS analysis on the new network compared to what we had before. So looked at all the existing bus stops, where they are, where they fit into the new network, where the best places to put the higher capacity ones, or the high quality ones, I suppose, as well, to best sort of support the community. So that work is ongoing, and that's why these numbers, new numbers I just mentioned, are different to what was in the paper. So.
Thanks. So is that then only going to be desktop, or will there be engagement with operators? Will there be engagement with users?
Yes, a bit of both. So the first, and also the fact that we've started going around and looking at them in real life. There's only so much you can do from behind a computer screen, but we're now looking to see whether there's any limiting factors. Whether there's a big tree in the way, so that won't work, or those sorts of factors that you can't perhaps tell on the computer. And then we'll be engaging with the operators once they're confirmed, and Horizons, we're working through that with them as well. So.
Great, thanks. In terms of the funding, are there any strings attached other than the time frame?
We have some requirement to show the efficacy of what we do, so we have to do some measuring and evaluation. Horizons is leading that piece of it to sort of show the uptake improvements and show the coverage and that sort of thing. That's their part of it. We're just doing the infrastructure is what we're focusing on.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor.
Councillor McLeod.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the report. I'm not sure whether this is a question, but I see it more of an appeal or request in terms of community engagement process, where you've outlined that, after the design, consultants will engage with a number of key partners across the city. A lot of partners have been listed here, but my plea is probably, will it be possible for you guys to also engage MMC, Minority Multicultural Council, in terms of, the design and that sort of thing? Would it be possible for you guys to also engage them as well? Because I'm sure they'll probably have a number of staff that want to contribute, and also given that a lot of those people who are usually migrants or refugees live in the outer parts of the city and that sort of thing, where buses can be quite not regular or accessible and that sort of thing.
So absolutely, we can add that to the list, no problem.
Councillor Isabella.
Thank you. I'm just looking at paragraph 5.1, talking about the small amount of public transport infrastructure work that we currently fund, which is mainly going to damaged bus stops. I'm just wondering what the rough amount that is and what amount we can expect it to go up with an increase in shelters.
So currently I think the budget's around the 20-odd thousand mark. If we have to replace a full bus stop at the moment, it's around 12 to 15,000. So that doesn't leave us a lot of room. So if you have to replace one a year, that's pretty much the budget gone. We're hoping to get the cost of the new ones. If you take the total amount of money divided by 90, it's probably going to be around $30,000. So we may have to look at increasing that annual budget, but we'd bring that option back to council before we made any hard decisions.
Thank you. And just another one was, do you anticipate any potential supply chain risk or other risk perhaps that not enough bus stops would be able to be rolled out in the time frame, and whether or not that would result in any penalty for us?
There is always that risk. The way we're approaching it is that we're going to we're hoping to have the bus stops built off-site in an engineering place and then lifted and placed in place rather than building them on site. So that's worked quite well for Wellington and Auckland. They've managed to get through a huge number, probably well more than 90, in this similar sort of time frame. So quietly confident Thanks.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Thanks for the report. In 4.2.2, you're talking about the bus stop design and the engagement with different groups. And I wonder if there's been any consideration of safety or, discussing with the Safety Advisory Board or whatever in terms of making sure, I see some of those designs that you've got pictures of are kind of enclosed bus stops more, making sure that we've got a safe bus stop design in terms of public safety for people who are waiting.
Through you, Mr Mayor, yes, yeah, absolutely. So we've engaged a consultant to come together with the specs for the design, and safety is definitely on that. Certainly for the people that are waiting at the bus stop, but also the traffic, the public pedestrians and cyclists and things, so it's hopefully all-inclusive.
Okay, yeah, so just to be 100% sure that I've made myself clear, I'm talking about, the safety of the people who are waiting if they're not visible from the road. So in other words, if there's a kind of an semi-enclosed bus stop that people can't see through. I don't mean the safety of the stop itself falling on people or people stepping out in front of a bus or whatever.
Yes, and the people that we've engaged design bus stops for a living, so those considerations will absolutely be taken into account.
Cool, thank you.
All right, thanks, Hamish. So we have the resolutions there, transport choices, public transport, one. Is there? Oh, maybe I'll just summarise then. It's around Chief Executive signing the Transport Choices Funding Agreement with NZTA for 5.5 million at a funding or FAR rate of 100%, that we delegate the authority of the Chief Executive to sign the Memorandum of Understanding with Horizons Regional Council for the joint delivery of this portion of the Transport Choices Public Transport Program that Horizons has received funding for. Number 3, Council approved the creation of a new program called Transport Choices Public Transport to reflect both the additional capital, new expenditure and additional subsidy revenue. And they as follows: an increase of 300,000 in the 22-23 financial year capital new budget for design, engineering, engagement, consultation, and an increase from NZTA's capital revenue of 300,000, being 100% of the new budget for the 22-23 financial year. For that, Council note commitment to an increase of 5.2 million in the 23-24 annual budget of capital new funding and an associated increase to NZTA's capital revenue of 5.2 in the 23-24 annual budget. And 5, that Council removed the 22-23 budget provision for Program 1680 citywide public transport infrastructure improvements of 93,000 and the associated capital revenue of 47.3 thousand. I'm happy to move those. Thank you, Councillor Dennison. Look, it's all pretty positive reading, and I think with Horizons rolling out the new, more frequent public transport bus program, this is timely for us because we'll need these shelters and this infrastructure on road. So, no further comments. There is. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Colleagues, just to briefly reflect on this as well, definitely a good news story. When I first joined council and got to have some of those transport conversations, I was a little bit bemused to find out that the total sum of the budget that we had in any one year was 3 bus stops. and when I asked about the notion of like a complete network, it just didn't seem to be anywhere. So it's just fantastic to see that we're now positioning ourselves to have a complete network approach alongside the substantial upgrade that Horizons is bringing to us in terms of higher peak frequencies and higher frequencies throughout the day as well. I think, we're kind of in that interesting space between, honestly, let's say a large town and a small city, and I think this kind of nudges us towards that kind of small city experience in a really positive way, and leaning towards more transport-led design thinking in terms of how we go about the city in the future. So sets us up really well. I'm really excited about what this investment brings to us, and looking forward to a lot of great bus shelters popping up because I and many other bus users don't really like standing in the rain.
Fair enough, councillor, fair enough. All right, we have the resolutions in front of us. We'll just vote, please. It's passed, 15 votes for and none against. All right, moving to number 13, which is around the Ferguson Street and Pitt Street intersection upgrade. Hamish is back in the hot seat, joined by Jeffrey. Welcome. Page 273 of your papers, councillors.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, I have Jeffrey Snedden with me, who's the project manager on this project, so will know a lot of the details a bit better than me. We'll take the report as read, that we are asking for additional money to finish the project, and we'll take any questions. Thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Thanks, Hamish. Just a couple of very quick questions. Paragraph 3.3.3, that refers to subsoil drainage behind new curb. Can you just explain what that is for us?
So in the Palmerston North Engineering Standards, we specify that we have to have pipes laid behind the curb to take away the water that gathers there. The more water we can get away from the road itself, the longer that road will last. In this case, unfortunately, the design team that did it didn't put that in the design itself. They didn't finish that piece, unfortunately.
An oversight?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And the second one is just around, I think, page 287. It just talks about the asphalt versus chip seal, and there's a change of decision there. Asphalt preferred over chip seal. Can you give us some understanding of the life difference between those two there? I know the document talks about, you know, high occupancy in turn bays and things like that. So can we get some understanding of the life difference of those two?
So on a standard straight piece of road, a chip seal will last anywhere between 7 and 10 years. Asphalt will last up to 25. It becomes really important where there's turning movements. So at an intersection, or like you mentioned, into properties, the life will be significantly less than the 7 to 10 years if it was chip seal. So in and out of the properties, that's where it'll start to fall to bits first.
Thanks, Hamish. Helpful. Mr Mayor.
Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just one question regarding page 285. It says here that we have the additional benefit that the $551,000 of debt would be transferable into the new water entity. I just wanted to know what planning we've done if that didn't come to pass and we had to service that debt ourselves. This is regarding the piping.
Sorry, I'll defer to the CFO. Okay.
Well, I can probably speak to that one. Through you, Mr Chair, good question. If the debt didn't transfer and that didn't come to pass, then that would sit on our books and we would be paying that as we would any other loan. The first thing that we would do when we consider this sort of thing is, can we actually, what type of expenditure? Is it a genuine renewal because it's at an age base or a failed piece of infrastructure? Typically, that's what we would classify as a renewal, and we have some, obviously, budgets year on year for those types of spending. In this case, it really is associated with the intersection. If we weren't doing the intersection at this point in time, we wouldn't be in a position we would be spending that sort of money on renewing the piece of pipe. So I always come back to, is it the right type of expenditure in the first instance? And I can justify it on that grounds, as well as the fact that there is an associated benefit if the reforms come to pass.
Excellent, thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thanks, Hamish, for the third report, the trifecta. 3.6.2 on page 282 refers to that new pedestrian crossing that we added in and talks about a safe walk sensor being used there. And I just wanted a little bit of insight in terms of how that works, and especially not only for people that are walking across that space, but people that might be on micromobility or wheelchairs, et cetera, kind of what we're hoping to deliver there as a user experience.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. The sensor is activated by weight, so mobility scooter or person on a bicycle or person standing will activate the sensor. What we're trying to get away from is this activation if a person changes their mind and moves away and not stopping the traffic, if you know what I mean. It cancels out the call button, for want of a better word.
Right, so there will be a call button.
Oh, yes, there still will be a call button on the pole.
Right.
But this is an added feature to ensure that the signals aren't going through a stop cycle or a phase if someone has moved on.
Cool, thanks, that's very helpful. Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Hapeta.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Hamish. Just one question around 3.3.4 on page 281. Talks about a section of curb and channel along Pitt Street that was not included in the construction drawings and therefore was not priced by the contractor, although was needed for the work. How often does that happen?
In general terms, since the beginning of this project and subsequently we've implemented some new processes around how we begin a project, including on-site visits with staff, designers, and if we can, contractors at an earlier stage to make sure that we're not leaving infrastructure that's out of context. In this case, the curb and channel was going to be left in place. It was a bit marginal. We determined that actually it needed to be done at the same time because that was going to be the point of weakness. So we'd be doing everything but this piece that wasn't any good, on the hopes that it would outlast the rest of the project.
More about it not being priced by the contractor. That was probably more my question.
Yes, it wasn't included in the initial schedule, unfortunately.
Second thing, going on to the next point about the contingency. So the contingency for the project's been used up completely?
Correct.
So this couldn't be used in the, couldn't be done in the contingency? This couldn't be?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, we're currently about $100,000 under the contingency, but we are aware of additional costs which are mentioned in the paper around extensions of time, et cetera, which will push us over the approved contingency that has been granted by council, which is why we're asking for that to be lifted.
Thank you. Thanks for your answers to the questions.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just some questions around the cost of the water main and the fact of that being moved from a renewal budget into a capital new budget. So I just wonder why we're not just maintaining the renewal budget as it is and just putting an entirely new unbudgeted capital new sum in.
So through you, Mr. Chair. So since the report was written, we've been in discussions and we're looking to move the budget as well as the costs to capital new. So the renewals budget will shrink by the 500,000 and a new capital new will grow by 500 and have the costs sit against it. So a zero net effect other than moving it into the correct type of funding mechanism. Sorry, does that answer your question?
No. I guess I understand that it's no longer a renewal, that it's capital new. But so why are we taking it from the renewals budget? Why are we not just leaving that renewals budget as it was for whatever renewals need to be done and just putting this on as a capital new item?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the 550 that we've spent on the job out of the renewals budget will stay there. So it won't, we're effectively leaving the 500 alone and spending it from somewhere else. No?
So,
No.
sorry, I don't know if I'm just having a low sugar moment in the afternoon, but in terms of the water main renewal budget, is it being reduced as a result of this or not? Is it staying the same?
I think to make things simpler, I might defer to our Three Waters manager, Mike Monaghan in the background, who can speak to that portion of the project.
They're hovering in the background, so we'll just...
If everyone else understands this and I'm just being silly, just please tell me, because I'm just not...
No, I'd like to know the answer too.
Well, so yeah, a slight correction. So what we would be doing is reducing the renewals budget and essentially transferring it across into the project budget, to clarify that. The question around leaving the equivalent money in the renewals to do more renewals, the simple answer is we didn't have any other renewals planned through that budget. So if we were to do that, I guess there would be certain questions raised around deliverability of whether we could all of a sudden get design done and actually get the work done.
Okay, thank you. That does explain it. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Sorry, I actually had a very similar question to Councillor Johnson. She's satisfied now, but I'm still a little bit... I have read in the rationale in the paper, it's really around the recommendation too. I'm really trying to understand why we would be wanting to transfer renewals, what we've funded for renewals, why we would then fund that via debt if we've already made that funding available through rating for renewals.
If possible, I'd like to defer to Cam.
Yep, maybe I can talk to that. There is a choice as elected members that you can make. I guess what we're trying to do is to correctly align the type of funding with the type of expenditure that's being incurred in this instance. And particularly when you do have a situation where you've got potential reform on the cards, I think it would be in the council's best interest to ensure that we are aligning the expenditure in the right way, because they are funded in different ways.
Thank you, that is helpful. So just to be clear, once Three Waters goes ahead, are we compensated differently for assets that we've borrowed to fund versus assets that we've spent renewals to upgrade?
So as part of my understanding of the Three Water reform program is that assets that we've incurred debt for in terms of capital new type assets, which is our policy, we will be recompensed for the debt that we hold for those assets. In terms of renewals, which is rates funded, there is no recompension for assets that are funded through renewals because they've essentially already been paid for. There's no liability sitting on those at the time of transfer.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And just one further quick follow-up question. So if we're reducing that renewal budget by 551,000, what impact does that have on our budget this year, or was that a program from this year? And what impact will that have on our budget this year?
Effectively, what you've done this year is you have created so the way renewals are funded is on a 3-year rolling average. So we'd be able to reflect that in the 3-year rolling average, or it gives you options if the case arises to do renewals in other areas because you've collected money, but we haven't identified those at this point in time. So you have funded essentially for a certain amount of renewals. It gives you some options in terms of the 3-year rolling average in that sense.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks Jeffrey, thanks Hamish. All right, we have the Ferguson Street Pitt Street intersection upgrade budget adjustment. There's 3 to go through. Council, and I'll ad-lib a little bit here, that Council approves the additional funding of $633,000 for the Capital New Program. 2059 Urban Transport Improvements, enabling Palmerston North Integrated Transport Initiative to increase the 22-23 budget item from $2,088,000 to $2,722,000 to enable the completion of the revised scope of Ferguson Street, Pitt Street intersection upgrade. Number 2, the council approved transferring $551,873 from program 218 citywide water main renewals by creating a capital new program to recognise the unplanned relocation and replacement of 3 waters pipes that needed to occur during the construction of the intersection upgrade. Number 3, that council delegate authority to the chief executive to vary the contract value to $3,923,763 and the contract contingency by a further $200,000 within the provisions included in the updated program budget, if required, for the successful delivery of the contract. I'm happy to move those, seconded by Councillor Dennison. Councillors I don't think I need to speak to this. This is, it needs to be done. We haven't got any choice. No other comments? We will vote, please. That's passed, 15 votes for, none against. Thank you. All right. We have a couple of, it was actually 3 council submissions to various government reforms. This first one is relatively important, and this is the council submission on the RMA, the Natural and Built Environment Bill and Spatial Planning Bill. There's a memo there from our City Planning Manager, Jono Ferguson-Pye. Jono. Page 291 of your papers.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and afternoon, councillors. Jono Ferguson-Pye, City Planning Manager. I'm sure you've all met Michael, our Principal Planner. Look, we're just here to seek approval for the submission to the Natural and Built Environment Bill and the Spatial Planning Bill. Unfortunately, we weren't given a huge amount of time to make the submission, so we've had to draft that fairly quickly, and the Mayor signed that submission under delegation, so we're here just to ask for approval. Essentially, what we did with the report is, well, the submission was, some very broad, identified some very broad issues relating to sort of relationship with wider local government reform and how this RM reform sat within that. We talked about planning committees and local democracy and the issue of localism, the importance of the built environment. We talked also about the national planning framework and the transition time. So I won't go into any of that detail. That's just a very broad description of some of the issues we identified in the submission. What we tried to do is also comment on some specific areas that we thought could be improved in the system. So rather than asking for the whole system to be wiped out, looked at it and said, actually, how can we actually make some recommendations that might actually make this new system operate and meet the needs of our communities a little bit better. So we didn't go into huge amounts of detail trying to, I think there was over 600 or 700 pages within the 2 bills. So we tried to keep the submission as high level as possible. So back to you, to the Chair, happy for myself or Michael to ask any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jono. Thanks, Michael. Look, we discussed it at Metro, actually, and it'd be fair to say that every council, Metropolitan Council, which basically equates for 70% of New Zealand's population, put in quite negative submissions about this. It's the one-size-fits-all. So have you had good interaction, or better interaction than we got on Friday, with the ministry officials?
Look, I think the ministry officials, they've been given quite a clear direction from central government, and we've obviously fed and had conversations with them. And I'd have to say, generally speaking, when we have had conversations, have been fairly responsive and had a good conversation there. But obviously, I think central government have got a view of how they want the new resource management reform to proceed, and so so central government officials obviously have have to make sure that they draft legislation to give effect to the government's, I guess, view on how the planning framework needs to move forward.
What does that mean for our local planning? You know, basically you, in effect.
Yeah, if I'm being really selfish, I'd say it has a big impact on my team as the policy team. My understanding is that the consents team under the new framework stays within council. I think for council, obviously, the reform package takes that local decision making and localism away from councils, and probably the plan making part of the legislation really sort of probably is a bit more technocratic than it has been in the past, and the ability for councils to influence planning decisions is probably reduced compared to the participatory process that we currently go operating under the RMA at the moment. So big impact in terms of, I guess, that localism certainly being taken away, and there's a lot more sort of control and sort of more of a technocratic management of the planning process is proposed.
Okay, Councillor Barn.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This is more of a process question than a content question, gentlemen, so through you. I'm noting in the background issue that the Mayor approved the submission under delegation, so I'm not quite clear why Council is now approving the submission. Surely Council is noting rather than approving.
Through your worship, you're correct. I've actually circled that on my report here as well. It should be that council is noting the submission. Unfortunately, some of our paperwork has approval in it, and that is well anyway, but it should be noted, correct.
So we can get that changed just for completeness. Thank you.
Do that. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you, John and Michael. Yeah, just reflecting on the timing and the short timing that led to us noting rather than approving. I guess, is there any thinking on your end about what we might be able to do by way of not necessarily arriving at detailed positions, but perhaps considering kind of in principle positions that could be used for kind of further out the pipeline, so that even if something isn't kind of in that narrow window that government gives us to submit, we kind of have a bit more, of an in-principle decision and position that council could reflect on kind of up front, because it kind of seems like at the moment we are, the train has already left the station and we're being asked to discuss the timetable.
Look, I think, Councillor, I think your description of the submission is fair. I think what we tried to do through the submission is that we could have spent a whole lot of time and effort trying to rile against and pick a whole lot of reasons why this shouldn't happen. And what we've tried to do is be a little bit more pragmatic and say, look, this system is going to be put in place. These are some ideas around how the system could work better, rather than a submission that maybe some other councils made that sort of really went hard at some of the underpinning principles of what was going on, and said, all of this shouldn't happen. And I guess what we tried to do is be a bit more pragmatic and say, well, look, this is likely to happen. Okay, within this framework, how can we potentially give you some guidance, central government, on how the system might work better? So that's the approach we've taken.
Yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate that. I guess what I'm trying to understand is, it's kind of looking back in time, but, thinking back kind of 6 to 12 months ago, could we have seen a likelihood that somebody's January was going to get ruined by writing this submission, and therefore as a council we might want to do some work upstream, rather than kind of leaving it all to the official window, which happens to be a terrible fit for our council decision-making processes?
Look, I would say that we did make and I'll ask Mike to contribute to this if he's got anything to add, but we did lodge a submission on the exposure draft quite a while ago. It's probably fair to say that in discussions with other councils, it's disappointed that central government probably didn't listen to a lot of the suggestions that were made through those submissions on the exposure draft. What we tried to do was take the exposure draft submission and then just build on that. It's probably fair to say also that that since the exposure draft came out and then we saw the detail of the bill, that the planning framework certainly seems a lot more complex and clunky than we probably thought it would be when we read the exposure draft. So, yeah, there are a few surprises in there, but I think if you go back to the exposure draft, we did try to give central government that message, and us, like a lot of other councils, don't seem to have been listened to on a number of fronts.
Yeah, I think if I was to add to that comment, I think many councils, including our own, have struggled to probably have more than superficial conversations with central government around the proposed changes. There have been many workshops, but they've been very high level and probably more directing feedback on the exposure draft. And to John O's point, I think what's been concerning is that there had been promises that the National Planning Framework would be in place at the same time as the Strategic Planning Act Bill and the Natural and Built Environment Act Bill, and that's a really critical part of the overall planning system that's being proposed, because that basically balances out all of the priorities around whether you're prioritising water quality or protecting versatile soil or promoting urban growth. And so all of the main moves in the new planning system are completely unsettled at this point in time, which is disappointing.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, Councillor. I think, under planning practice, one of the most, the hardest parts of planning practice, and you'll know as a commissioner, is when you've got competing interests, resource management interests. So you might look at, renewable energy and wind farms and enabling those, but then you've got the tension, for example, with protecting outstanding natural landscapes, and there's that tension there. And the issue we've got with the National Planning Framework is that the National Planning Framework is supposed to actually give us guidance on how to deal with that tension. But at the moment, we don't have any guidance from central government at all as to how they might actually resolve those tensions. So you've got a planning framework and say a new regional plan, and we know the mechanism that plan gets developed by, but we actually don't know how the higher order document, being the National Planning Framework, actually manages those resource management tensions, which is a little bit of a vacuum that we're operating in at the moment.
Oh, thank you for that answer and for the specific examples as well of areas of concern, Mr. Mayor.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. All right, we have the council submission, and we resolve that we note the council submission to the Natural and Built Environment Bill and the Spatial Planning Bill, included as attachment 1. I'll look to move that, seconded by Councillor Dennison. I'll just make a couple of comments, and look, I think it's really sad because we got a very firm view that the submission probably is not going to make not make much difference, because the decision, unfortunately, the decision's probably already been made. And we all agreed that something needed to change with the old RMA. The principles of a collaboration, recognising tangata whenua and the treaty, of course, better protection around the environment, were all things that everybody could really wholeheartedly back. But I suppose it's the one size that fits all. And the constant meetings that we've had, and I've been in the same room with Jono and David and Wade and talked to officials, and we get lots of nods and lots of, yes, we'll have a look at that, and then nothing changes. So it's really disappointing. This is a real loss of local voice, and this will have far-reaching implications for this council and all of local government, for our local iwi as well, because we have a significant say in what happens in our city, we will have a far less say now, which is really disappointing. It's going towards a regional model, obviously. The devil is in the detail, the implementation. This regional planning committee, there's no overlays, so we've lumped in with Ruapahu right down to Otaki. One vote on that regional committee. That regional committee could be 25 people. So I just can't see any goodness in this at all. So it's really, really disappointing, and it will get through. I'm absolutely sure of it. So it's a pity that they haven't looked at population bases. They haven't looked at what certainly the metro sector has said, and I'm just not sure how we can influence it from here on. But I've spoken to our MP and stressed that we do need to have a discussion at some stage, and I'm hopeful that may still come. But thank you to the officers for what you've done there in terms of submission. All right. Others. Councillor Sabellin.
Kia ora, thank you. Just a huge thank you to the officers who worked on this, especially over the break. That's a massive undertaking. And as has been pointed out, the feedback period falling over the holiday period is poorly timed, to say the least. This is the biggest legislative change for the environment and planning in over 30 years, and it's essential that we get it right. So I'm really disappointed in the timing of that process. And so I thank you very much to the officers and for that work, for the thoroughness, and also for the opportunity to have some input despite that timeframe. I did give feedback on many aspects of this bill, but the biggest concern for me, as the Mayor has picked up, is the major diminishment of local voice in decision-making through the establishment of the regional planning committees, because at the moment, our ability to target our infrastructure and investment to adapt and strengthen us against the devastating effects of climate change and severe weather rests with us, and the willingness of the public and the resourcing to be able to do it. And with what we are experiencing this week, today, this month, this season, there's an increasing expectation back on us that we will be rising to this challenge and being able to be proactive and better protect us. Under this new proposal, our ability to target our infrastructure and adapt and strengthen against adverse weather is going to be resting with a regional planning committee, which will be making planning decisions for the entire region. And we will have representatives on that committee, but what it does is actually reduce our ability to respond to our climate risk and to protect our properties and communities to a proportionality on a committee. I cannot find that acceptable for our community. It also means that the effectiveness and advocacy skills of our representatives on those committees becomes paramount, because the committee itself is not accountable to our communities that it is making critical decisions for. So the people we have at the table need to be extra effective at getting good outcomes for Palmerston North. Also just wanted to pick up on, by not having the national planning framework ready to go at the same time, especially with its ministerial discretion for setting environmental limits and targets, it further clouds that issue of how responsive we can actually be. It's at once a one-size-fits-all approach that's also apparently highly customisable at the minister's discretion, and that to me also has red flags all over it. On the one hand, we've got the Future for Local Government review saying local is best, and on the other hand, you're chucking the local approach out the window and setting it all up to a regional level. We are the people with the biggest vested interest in the outcomes for Palmerston North, and a proportionality on a committee isn't going to be able to capture that. So I have major concerns with this. I feel that the key tools that we've got on the ground here for mitigating against climate risk are stormwater and planning, and both of those things are going to be removed from the local decision making to dissolved into part of a larger group. Palmerston North is only one of those vulnerable communities. We're going to have to really step up our advocacy game in the future when we're looking at how this is going to work out. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to yourself and Councillor Sabellin for very clearly and articulately covering the ground and the real issues that this bill does create for local communities. So I won't retraverse too much of that, but I will reflect a little bit on what to me is kind of ironic, that when you go into a community and you start talking about taking something tangible, people get up in arms really quick. So even if it's only a water pipe, people get really, really het up about 3 waters. But if you have something like this, and you're taking away people's voice, you're taking away people's agency, you're taking away people's ability to actually make decisions about what will happen to them in their community, and you get a few kind of theoretical thought pieces in newsroom, you know. And just that total disconnect between the community's ability to recognize, mobilize, and respond around when we're challenged in terms of our physical assets versus when we're kind of challenged in terms of our voice and democracy is quite stark to me. And I do share the concerns that the Mayor and Councillor Zabellin have expressed around that loss of localization of decision-making, even when those decisions will have quite profound impacts in communities. I do want to thank the officers for the good work in writing a submission that reads particularly well around the local democracy area, the national planning framework, the environmental limits, and really pleased to see some strong language in there around greater protection of urban trees. Let's just hope somebody's listening. Mr. Mayor.
Well put, councillors. All right, we will vote. And that's 15 votes to none, thank you. All right, number 15's another council submission. This is around Future for Local Government review and the draft report. So this is from our governance manager, Hannah. Page 311, councillors.
This submission, unlike the previous one, is yet to be submitted, so you are approving it, members, and thus any amendments are certainly open to that. We've actually got 2 whole weeks left on this one before the central government's requiring it. You've been part of the process of this one and making sure that your voices are what is reflected in this document, so really just happy to take any questions or comment. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Hannah. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just one question. It's possibly not for you, Hannah. I just would like some clarification regarding page 321 and 322. So it says here we're supporting item 14 that local government in partnership with central government explores funding and resources that enable and encourage councils to C, embed social/progressive procurement and supplier diversity as standard practice in local government, etc. What does that mean?
The only procurement specialist in the room is who I'm looking at. At this point, the support statement was we support consideration of those things, not we support the actual item. That's as far as I can comment. Sorry, can the CFO help me out or not?
I think the statement that the office has made that in principle we support the investigation into this as opposed to any specific outcome, and I guess there would be more to come as to what a specific outcome would look like post or during this reform process.
So what I'm trying to ask is what is a social/progressive procurement and supplier diversity as standard practice in local government? What is that? If we're voting in favour of supporting it, it's not a major. I'm just interested as to what it actually is or what that means.
It could mean different things to different people, I guess. But in terms of my understanding of things like social procurement, it's more than just looking at, say, lowest conforming procurement and that sort of thing. It's taking into account the impact of procurement potentially on a workforce within an area. So that's something that argument's sake, what would the impact be on people from doing the procurement, so wider community impacts?
All right, thank you.
All right. That is us. Okay, we have that council resolves, approves the submission of Future for Local Government Review Draft Report, Attachment 1, subject to any amendments. I'll look to move that. Seconded by Councillor Dennison. Thank you, Hannah, for the work there and other officers that have fed into that, and we will vote. That's passed, 15 votes for, none against. Thank you. On to number 16, again another submission, this time on the Water Services Legislation Bill. And I'll ask Mike Moynihan, our Three Waters Manager, to speak to that, please. Page 331, councillors.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Mike Moynihan aho. Good afternoon, Your Worship and Councillors. I'd like to acknowledge, firstly, the collaboration of many council officers in putting this submission together. In particular, the Chief Infrastructure Officer, who produced a substantive work. Unfortunately, Sarah's had travel disruptions due to the cyclone and isn't able to present today. But in the main, this submission supports the position of both LGNZ and Taituara and focuses on the need for the water service entity to deliver the best outcomes for our communities. A draft submission was circulated to elected members, and I'd like to take this paper as read, and with the help of my colleagues, we'll try and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. We've got a couple here. Councillor Isabella.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick question from me. At 3.9, it says it would be prudent for PNCC to update its road reconstruction standards to ensure they reflect our current requirements as part of planning for the transition. I'm just wondering if you could provide a little more context or how long that would take.
I might just pass that over to our roading manager, who could help me there.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question. So I take it to mean that we need to include revision of the engineering standards so that the roads are built with the new entity in mind. A bit like any other utility, we'd expect certain reinstatement standards and that sort of thing within our road corridor.
And that's different to our current standards, or just checking that it all is aligned?
Correct.
Great, thank you very much.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Two questions. Mike, do we have any estimate of how much officers' time would be required to comply with the transition requirements as outlined in the bill?
I don't have that information at hand, but we could certainly try and come back to you with that information.
Yeah, think of a number and triple it.
Perhaps I could have a go at that one. So just to give elected members a bit of an indication at the moment, you'll be aware that we received some tranche funding for the transition work that's progressing currently at the moment. That was, and actually Julie's here in the background, she's leading that work for us. That was about $850,000. We expect to probably have spent that by 30 June this financial year, with a year still to go.
Thank you. That begins to paint a bit of picture. My second question relates to one of many matters raised in the report, but 3.2.6, Mike, makes reference to water service entities taking over consent processes as I've read it, and just wondered about the implications for the Nature Calls consenting path that we're on, given the time frame and proposal that is in this bill.
Yeah, that's a good question, Councillor. And the representatives from the DIA have been fully involved in the Nature Calls project, and they're aware that as transition occurs, that they will become the consent holders. So they're fully immersed in the process.
And so, effectively, even at this stage, we're becoming kind of just the pilot and they're the navigator type of thing, to use perhaps a poor analogy. But I guess it seems like we're already being put into a side or a back seat in something that we've invested a huge amount in as a community.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to respond to that, but, you know, as council officers, we'll carry on working up until the transition date for PNCC. And at that point, I believe that the new entity will then be driving the project.
And the likelihood of consent being granted prior to that transition date is?
What's that? Unlikely, in my opinion. Yeah.
That's what I thought. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. So, Mike, I just had a question about recommendation 10, which is the recommendation that stormwater be left out of the bill, or at least initially. Can you explain how we came to that position?
I know there's a number of my colleagues who've got you know, some information to add to this, but you know, from an officer's perspective, stormwater is possibly the more complex of the three waters when it comes to transition, and we just believe that more work needs to happen before it's ready to become part of that.
So, given there was a debate at a council level and by a majority council substantially agreed with the Three Waters proposal, how is it that we're then coming up with a submission that is substantially different from that agreed position of council?
Through Mr. Mayor, obviously that vote around the chamber was taken prior to this bill being released as well, and for submissions being provided back on it. It isn't, council isn't saying that it shouldn't be handed over at some particular point in time. As part of this piece of legislation, there are a number of factors relating to stormwater, including delaying or having councils continue to collect the funding related to stormwater for a continued period of time. All that we're suggesting in here is that perhaps that actually matches up a little bit better because there's some uncertainty and it's not clear in this piece of legislation or in this bill as to what the timeframes are relating to stormwater.
Okay, so just to be clear then, that aspect of the submission is guidance from officers?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and that's a good segue from Councillor Johnson, because my interest lies also in the transfer of stormwater and that recommendation. Is there any suggested timeline in terms of when that might actually be a practical time for that to occur?
We don't have a defined timeline, but I think, you know, practically speaking, we'd be looking the next 18 months to 24 months for that.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm really interested is sort of the implications and the risks for that. For example, paragraph 4.5 talks about stormwater management interfacing with land use planning and stormwater rating, etc., etc. So in terms of our recommendation that we delay the transfer of that to Three Waters, what are the practical implications and risks for council to consider if that were to be taken as a good recommendation?
I might see if I can defer that to the Chief Executive.
Yes, sorry, my apologies, Councillor. I was just answering a question here at the same time as that part of it. Perhaps, and I just missed the end part of it. Could you just repeat that again for me?
Yeah, I suppose what I'm really interested in is if that recommendation was actually accepted as being appropriate, that we delay, and we've heard that 18 months might be an appropriate time. In the meantime, whilst we go through that process, what are the likely risks and implications for council, particularly around planning? And, you know, obviously we've only seen today that we're being asked to restrict our water use because we've got wastewater stormwater entering our wastewater system, which is causing us some issues. So I really want some clarity around the risks, please.
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Mayor, and exactly for the risks that you just identified as to the reasons why stormwater needs some more clarity and it needs some more work done on it in order to actually understand what those significant issues are. You know, we're aware of the risks that we currently have as a council around stormwater management through overland flow paths and discharges and those sorts of things. So those sorts of matters, the risks that we currently have around stormwater will still be those same things. All we're suggesting is that more work in terms of the transition from councils to any new water services entity needs to be thought about more closely before it's actually handed over, because there are impacts on roading, connections with the roading network and a whole raft of other things like that as well.
And I suppose with that, do we have capacity within council to actually do that, to do that work, achieve that work within that timeline?
Yeah, again, through Mr. Mayor, I guess those are the ongoing conversations with the water services entity about what it is that they might be paying for, or DIA, and when that might happen. And it does have an impact on our staff. You know, we're having to go through the process at the moment of making sure that our staff are well looked after as part of the transition. That's the key feature of it. But do we keep some back here, or is it a contract arrangement that we have with the new water services entity, or what does that actually look like? So there's some more clarity and detail that needs to be resolved around stormwater in particular.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Not to labour the point, but my question is also around recommendation 10, which is if we're recommending it, we're suggesting that that's what we want to happen. And my concern is particularly around staffing, is that a number of our 3 water staff at the moment are 3 water staff, not 2. And so if this is what we are recommending and wanting to happen, people such as yourself, Mike, who would likely end up transferring into a new entity, would we end up then needing to hire one stormwater manager and a team to be able to maintain those for whatever this transition period is? And if so, our advice up until now has been we are not including stormwater in our long-term planning, but if we are suggesting that this should stay as a part of council for a longer period of time, do we need to introduce those considerations into long-term planning if that's what we want to be able to happen?
Could I just get the CE to answer that?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just to clarify that, because I've just gone back and read that recommendation again myself now, as well as part of the conversation. So we're recommending that stormwater is not transferred on the 1st of July 2024, but what it shouldn't say is that it doesn't mean that we're not planning on transferring it at all. So what we're saying is that the recommending that the transfer of it is deferred until the stormwater issues are completely sorted out. That's what the recommendation is. So I could actually, taking in what Mike has suggested as well, is that maybe, you know, we could be looking at an 18-month or 2-year period beyond that date.
All right, thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Mike. That's all the questions. So we've got the submission there on the water services bill. Council resolves to approve the submission on the Water Services Legislation Bill, Appendix 1. The Council will note the response to the Department of Internal Affairs, DIA, on the draft guidance and DIA's oversight and monitoring guidance. I'm happy to move that, seconded by Councillor Dennison. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I won't be supporting the first recommendation. I'm not comfortable with recommendation 10 on not transferring stormwater, and I don't really feel there's been enough direction from elected members around this submission. in terms of, I'm not clear where that recommendation has come from. It was, news to me that was our council position. And so I think I'm not comfortable with the submission as is, and so I won't be supporting it. And my substantial objection is around recommendation 10, the transfer of stormwater. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Look, councillors, having had a fair bit to do with this over the 4 years that it's been in the pipeline, I think taking the advice of the officers, certainly around the stormwater, it's a timing issue. It isn't, we're not doing it. It's a timing issue. And dealing with some of the officers in that space, they are specialist stormwater engineers. So I have some confidence in the guidance and advice we're getting. It's a timing aspect, and I'm quite happy to follow the advice. They know what they're doing in that space. And we always knew stormwater was, because it's got so many touch points, that it's the hardest one, whereas obviously our freshwater and our wastewater are more ring-fenced. Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I hadn't thought we might have an interesting debate here, but who knows, we might be on the verge of one. I really had come into this meeting feeling that we could be quite true to our in-principle council position around Three Waters, and still be open to significant adjustments such as we put in recommendation 10. So I don't actually see those things being in opposition to each other. We are getting a masterclass right now in just how hard it is to manage stormwater. And there's parts of this organization, parts of this country that are experiencing that in quite radical ways. And I think taking as much time as we need to do that as well as we can will serve our community well. We've got an incredible amount of complexity in stormwater relative to the other two. Overall, I will say I'm grumpy about this bill. The further we get into, let's say, the detail of what's happening behind the Three Waters banner, it frustrates me to no end that we're looking now at a sweeping and complex bill. I was astonished in reading the report. I haven't read the bill, but astonished in reading the report just how complex and challenging this space is. It's creating an absolute mountain of bureaucracy on the pretense of going and getting some cheap money, when the Crown already has cheap money that they could co-invest. And it frustrates me to no end that we are facing this sort of bureaucratic tangle and challenge for our community, that we're running out of the money 12 months before we've even done the transition work that was there to fund the transition, shows the sort of challenges that we're facing. So, to be honest, I hadn't figured out if I was going to vote in support at the risk of kind of encouraging the madness, or abstain out of frustration, or vote against. And I've had people speaking from all angles now, so see where we land. Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Isabella.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick comment from me, particularly around recommendation 10. I think before we get too far down that road, we need to ask ourselves the question of whether or not our recommendation would be heeded, listened to, or accommodated in any way before we... Not saying that it might not, but I think before we get too far and down the nuts and bolts, actually think about whether this recommendation is likely to get traction before we start thinking about how it's going to be accommodated for at our end. And just to tautoko Councillor Barrett, again, that I'm in two minds about the message supporting the submission sends. Particularly, there are some things in there, the sweeping bureaucracy, that council will become a collection agency on behalf of the Water Services Agency, and they will bill the councils. Also, at 3.34, the bill gives this water service ability to collect charges from people who are within 100 metres of a water supply or wastewater network, but choose not to be connected. Just things like that that are infuriating to read, and I'm glad they're in our submission, but it's, yeah, I find myself in a similar position to Councillor Barrett, that it's hard to know which way to go. Thank you.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I didn't want to sit here in silence. I just really wanted to, again, support Councillor Barrett's comments around the position that we've found ourselves in and now the process stall. Again, the money running out, it seems absurd. And even not having the subtleties of transition, it all expected to go in one whole tranche, and yet there's some advice suggesting that we do it in a staged way with the stormwater. I'm comfortable with that. I'm going to support this submission. I feel like at the end of last year we were able to have that notice of motion where we could actually put a view, or vote at least, on our position against that. So an opposition vote here now, I'm just saying that I feel like we've been able to say our piece and put our votes on the table, and now trying to get the best outcome for the city. It's still challenging. So up here to say I'm still grumpy, but I will support it. Don't say that I'm a fan of this whole process. I'm not, but I'm being pragmatic. Thank you.
Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I feel I'd be remiss to not make some comment on Three Water in the Chamber, given my history. I just wanted to make a few points. Firstly is, I agree with Councillor Barrett and Councillor Bellin with the frustrations of having a centralised bureaucracy and taking everything that we've already discussed in this chamber before, but not having a submission doesn't make that any better, is the issue that I come to. I don't see voting in favour of this as voting in favour of the legislation or against the legislation. Simply, the situation we're in is this is the bill in front of us, and we either have a submission or we don't. The government is not going to take us not having a submission as a sign of opposition to the bill. It's simply going to take it as a view that we didn't put the effort in to put a submission to them. So I don't see, I understand the frustration, trust me, but I don't see how that would fix your feelings or where we're coming from. We've had our chance to come to a position, we chose not to, and that's fine. The concern around recommendation 10, though, I do share, particularly with Councillor Johnson, and I agree with Councillor Ballin. At the end of the day, the likelihood that the government's going to read this and go, oh my goodness, let's not take stormwater as part of it, is remarkably low. But at the end of the day, why should we make a recommendation if we don't mean it and if it's not what we want to happen? Otherwise, why make recommendations at all? So I do agree with the Mayor, we need to trust the experts, but the concern I have, as I alluded to in my questions, is particularly around personnel, as we're going to have multiple entities and councils competing for a very limited pool of people who have expertise in those areas, who are going to be focused on building new systems and new entities, not maintaining old systems and old entities. So I don't see a world in which trying to maintain a little bit of it is going to be affordable, is going to be able to be resourced, or is going to be effective. I agree we need to be handing over good data, and I've expressed that opinion before. We need to have good information on our stormwater system to pass into these new entities, but is simply delaying that process. There's always going to be more. We are not going to be handing over a pristine system that is ready to go. That is, the driving force behind this is the work that needs to do, and I believe these entities are going to be well aware of the work that they need to do in all of our water systems. So I'm not going to move a motion to remove recommendation 10. I think we're getting down in the weeds in it, but I am comfortable supporting it, although I don't personally agree with that particular recommendation.
All right, just to write a reply. Thanks very much for your comments, and I'm going to use Councillor Dennison's language here. I'm not a fan either, and I'm on record for that. But look, it's happening, and it's how we influence it now that's important. Just my final comments on the stormwater, and if you turn to LGNZ page 394, they sum it up pretty well around the complexity of stormwater and it being phased. And again, I come back to there are officers in this organisation that are stormwater experts. We're perhaps not what Councillor Wood was suggesting, where smaller councils have water engineers that cover everything. So if we're going to grow as a city, we just need to understand what our assets are, what our infrastructure is, and how it's all connected. And I would far prefer to do that rather than saying, here you go. Somebody else with absolutely no understanding is running it. So again, I'd err on the side of caution, taking some advice on people that know what they're talking about. and go with that. So anyway, if we could vote, please. And it's passed 13 votes for and 2 against. All right, moving on to number 17 is the council work schedule on page 417. And I'll take that as, actually it's quite a bit, it goes from 417 to 420. I'll take that. We received that. I'll look to move that. Seconded by Councillor Dennison. Are there any matters arising from that? Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just a question around item 5 being the consideration of the draft consultation document for the annual budget on the 1st of March, going to the 1st of March meeting. I'm just wondering what the thinking is in that going to the 1st of March meeting if our annual budget adopting the consultation document and supporting information is actually going to the 15th of March. Like how can we give direction to a consultation document prior to sort of approving the content? Am I not asking that clearly?
We normally discuss things before we agree on it, but I'll just default to our CFO.
Yeah, through Mr. Chair. Normally we would go through the process of agreeing the material that's going to go in the consultation document and programs and so forth that form part of that, and then we bring back the full package on the 15th for adoption. I think if you recall last year that followed a very similar process, and I'm assuming that's been that way before, but I can't comment for that.
March 1's effectively the old committee of council. We go through things, and then the 15th is when it is adopted.
Oh, so it says and supporting information over the page. I just hadn't noticed. That makes a bit more sense.
Cool. Excellent. We will vote. Okay, that's passed 15 votes for and none against. All right, moving through number 18, which is where we go to part 2, exclusion of the public. I'll look to resolve that the public be excluded for the following reasons around negotiations and tender contracts. I'll look to move those, seconded by Councillor Dennison. No matters arising. We will vote, please. It's passed 15 votes for and none against. Councillors, we're just going to have a small break now before we get into part 2. We've been going for a good couple of hours, but anyway, we've broken the back of that. And we'll be back in here for those online at 10 to 4.